certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Today in court, it was revealed how hairs found on the clothes of Ciara Glennon were linked to long-time suspect Lance Williams. Welcome to day 39 of Claremont in Conversation, and Natalie Bonjolo joining you with the West's Tim Clark and Emily Moulton. And I found this evidence today quite fascinating. So did scientists suspect that they had found a possible match back then?
I think so. Well, from what we heard from the forensic scientist Martin Blooms today was that under the direction of the macro task force, they found these hairs, and so they were he said that they were basically asked to match them to samples of Lance Williams' hair, who at the time was somebody who police was a suspect that they suspected of the murders. So he just said that basically they were looking at those samples, and there was, I think, one or two that they thought they found on Ciara's T-shirt, and possibly one on her skirt, maybe more, that they thought were a possible match to Williams. But as Mr. Blooms explained later on, under re-examination from Brad Hollingsworth, the prosecutor, that and I hope I pronounce it right, morphological test or process that they carry out is basically, he said in layman's terms, it was basically a looking test, or it's an appearance test. So they were only accredited to look at hair samples and under a microscope and to see how similar they were. But he said it was more of a exclusion rather than inclusion. So that's how they sort of thought of that test back then. So an example he gave was that if a suspect had red hair and the hair was black, well, therefore you would say, no, this is not that person. But then if the hair was dark brown or black, well, they say it's a possible match, but therefore they didn't have the technology or they weren't accredited to then look further into that hair. So that's what he was saying sort of later on, but initially when we first heard it was like, oh, okay. So back then this is one of the reasons why they thought it might have been him, because they found hair that possibly matched him. So that was sort of that part that today, which everyone's sort of ears pricked up when that was mentioned. So,
and Tim, how did they get this hair from Lance Williams to actually sample?
Well, it hasn't specifically been said in court, Matt, but we do know that back in '98, Mr. Williams was pulled over by the police, arrested and taken into major crime, we assume, and was questioned for a long time, 17 hours or so. And during that process, he voluntarily gave the police DNA samples and hair samples. And we are now finding out, slowly but surely, what the police did with those samples. And as Em's just pointed out, one of the things they did do was in 2002, 2003, they sort of looked at the physical exhibits from Ciara, picked off some hairs, and very closely looked to see if they were a match to Lance. So he even then, 4 or 5 years after Lance had been arrested, he was still obviously the very, very, very main suspect, because you don't do that. You don't you don't go to all that trouble tasking, senior scientists to do multiple examinations of major exhibits on the major case in the state, unless you think you might find something. So again, the scrutiny of Mr. Williams was literally down to the hairs on his head.
And I mean, I always just find it quite bizarre, really, that that there weren't alarm bells about Lance Williams. I mean, you've got this guy who voluntarily gives his DNA, he voluntarily gives his hair. There's nothing in the tracking of him, and they're following him for, years and years on end. Yet, is there no alarm bells that maybe this isn't him?
Well, I mean, that's That's a question that so many people have asked for so many years, not less than Lance himself at many times. When the covert surveillance of him basically became overt over the years, and police cars were quite openly sitting outside his house for days at a time. He would get searched, he would get stopped, he would get followed in his car. It was no. It was. I mean, you'll remember now. It was absolutely no secret that this was a man, to the point where he was giving interviews to major news networks, including Seven and Alison Fan, our good friend Alison Fan.
And Ali has, of course, talked to us before about that and said that, he gave this interview that lasted 2 to 3 hours, and eventually she was sort of backing out of the door and going, okay, well, I've got to go, and saying to herself, this isn't the guy. Yeah. This is definitely not the guy.
Yeah, and Ali felt confident enough to actually ring the police and tell them that. Whether they took any notice, it wouldn't appear so, because the scrutiny continued right up until the end of 2008, which, as we discussed at the end of last week, that was when the DNA went over to the UK, came back, and was then, we don't know this for sure, but we can really read between the lines that they ran Lance's DNA against it, and it didn't come back. And so, and it was right at the end of 2008 where he was officially told that he was no longer a suspect, and that leaked out. And so, when we've talked about eureka moments many times over the podcast, what that moment must have been like to the police, who spent so much time and so many resources on this man to finally get the DNA hit, and then it come back as not the man that you thought it was going to be. It must have been a massive blow.
Reverse eureka. How is this evidence today actually relevant to the case against Bradley Edwards?
Well, that's a very good question, because what this was going to was Martin Bloom's himself. We discussed him yesterday. Very senior scientist at Pathwest, was intimately involved in work on samples from Karakatta and both the murder victims. But this was Paul Yovich cross-examining him on his practices, and what we gleaned from that questioning was that it would appear that Mr. Yovich today and coming in the days to come, or the weeks and months to come, wants to cast some doubt over Mr. Bloom's practices, and the collection of these hairs, and what he did with them, and the way he did it. It looks like he's going to come under some more scrutiny, because at some point, Justice Hall, as he's wont to do, piped up and said, what is the relevance of these hairs, particularly a reference to the hairs that were found or recovered from Ms. Glennon's bra when it was being examined by Mr. Blooms and another scientist. And Mr. Yovich, quite, revelatory, really said, well, we think we have some mitochondrial DNA evidence relating to particularly one of these hairs off his bra, which will go to Pathwest practices and Mr. Bloom's practices as well. And once again, that was another ear prick moment, because A, we hadn't heard any of the defence's potential DNA evidence, and B, the fact that it's mitochondrial DNA, which the prosecution isn't going to use at all, was again something that came out of today that hadn't come up before.
Yeah. So just to clarify the situation with the exclusion of Lance Williams, so they were saying it's a possible match, but really it was just that they had similar hair. It didn't actually identify anybody. Yeah.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And that was made clear through Mr. Bloom's evidence that this was a visual inspection. I mean, a close visual inspection under a microscope, but still it was looking at the sample hairs they had from him, looking at the sample hairs they had from Ms. Glennon, and then looking at these hairs that they were taking off the various bits of clothing, putting them on a slide, putting them on a microscope, and looking at them. And on at least 2 occasions, they put on the worksheet that there was a possible match. But when asked in re-examination, Mr. Bloom said, that's all it was. We looked and they were similar. They looked similar. But we couldn't definitely say it was person A, person B, and more testing would have to be done. And he also said, if I got another hair from someone else, not Mr. Williams, but another random person, it might well have looked very similar to the hairs that we got as well. So it was an on-site examination of these hairs that potentially could lead somewhere. But that was all it was.
And in terms of, you mentioned this mitochondrial DNA, so did they give an explanation of what that is exactly, and was there any talk of how it could come up later in the trial?
They didn't give an explanation of what it was, but from what we were able to sort of Google in the, the seconds that we had between us all, from what we understand, and I'm sure Brendan will be able to clarify in detail tomorrow for everyone. But from what we understand, it traces a person's sort of is it matrial line or mother line ancestry? So it basically sort of goes from to children passed out, basically the DNA that's passed from your mum, basically, on that sort of the female heritage line. So that's how I understand it, I think, as simply as I can explain it. But they didn't explain any more. Well, I think today there was a lot of like little tidbits thrown in today, but then again, whenever the cross-examination's going on, it's always these little bits, but then never any more explanation. And sometimes it's like, is it going anywhere? Will it pop up again in a couple of months? Or was it just thrown in there to create a bit of doubt, I guess? Yeah.
And Tim, you mentioned the items of clothing that the hairs were taken from that belonged to Ciara Glennon. Were they shown in court today?
They were, pictures of them, not the actual exhibits themselves. So the practice by that time at Path West was that any physical exhibit that you were examining, you would take a photo of, and then a copy of that photo would be attached to the worksheet. And so that's what we saw today. So there was Miss Glennon's shirt, her bra, her underwear, and then there was a skirt. There was a drawing done of the skirt, not an actual picture. And there was a warning given by the judge to everyone in court, including Dennis Glennon, Ciara's father, that these would be shown on the screens. They were going to be treated as sensitive, but the screens, the screening screens weren't up. So that would have taken a little bit of time. So the judge was, given that there were clothing and no actual body parts were being shown, he said, look, I'm happy to have them shown in court, but please be aware that what you might see might be distressing, and if you do think you'll be distressed, then this is your chance to leave. And those, apart from a brief glimpse of Ciara's shirt during Mrs. Barbagallo's opening, that was the first time we'd seen those for any length of time. And they were, as dirty as you might expect. But they were still, they were able to be seen in quite some detail. And then the examination of them, particularly for the hairs, was gone into in more detail.
Was it, to look at them, was it distressing to see? Did Ciara's father stay in the courtroom? Did he?
Yeah, he did. Dennis did stay in. I don't think anyone left at that point. And as we've said all the way along, that in such an impersonal setting, when you see such personal items, and you can't really get more personal than a young lady's underwear. It does. You just, as much as you try and prepare yourself for a day, potentially hearing distressing evidence when you see these images, it does take you aback for a second or two, realising that those were the items that she was wearing on the last night of her life.
Another item that Martin Blooms tested was Jane Rimmer's guess watch. What did that reveal, if anything?
Yeah, that was interesting, Em, wasn't it? We heard about another potential forensic procedure that they use or possibly could use.
Sonication, I think.
Yeah, sonication. Thank you, Em. You dug me out of a hole there. Which is the use of, as I understood it, the use of sort of high-frequency sound waves to try and shake loose any DNA material that might be on this watch. And this and this was also brought up in cross-examination, and this was also pointed towards, as interesting as it was also pointed towards Mr. Blooms himself, because the explanation of that was that for some time it would appear that Mr. Blooms had told the police that this process had actually occurred. But it then transpired that it hadn't been done. This process hadn't been done, and it was in an email that Mr. Blooms wrote to a detective to say, good news, it hasn't been done, so this could potentially be another avenue. But Mr. Jovich then pointed out to Mr. Blooms, well, were you in the habit of telling police you'd done something when you hadn't? And it really emerged what he was getting at, which was, were you stuffing the police around? And at one point, Mr. Blooms said, are you calling me a liar? Mr. Jovich backed away a little bit from that, but he didn't back away from the main point, which was, were you being as professional as you could be, and were you being as open with the police as you could be?
Then another sort of section to that was when they were asking him about the examination of the vegetation collected as well at Jane's crime scene. They sort of touched on it in relation to one of the samples, which was RH21. In his opening, Paul Jovich had sort of said that RH21, which was like a piece of like a twig or a branch that was found on top of Jane's body at the scene, had actually yielded a partial profile from a victim of a crime that was unrelated to the Claremont murders. So he touched on that, but then sort of it didn't go any further than that. I don't know whether that's going to come up later, because perhaps it was someone else who was responsible for collecting that or testing that. We're not really sure. So because now we're at that stage of the testing stage, so perhaps there's another witness that question will be asked of. But that sort of came up as well in that sort of line of questioning.
So it sounds like the defence today really were quite tough in their questioning of Martin Bloom's procedures and practices. Did the prosecution re-examine and come to his defence in any way?
Yeah, they did. Yeah, it was a bit of a velvet sledgehammer today. Mr. Jovich's style is quite homely. Quite softly spoken. I mean, he doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't get angry or argumentative. But he got to his point pretty quick, and then right at the end, he did come to quite a shocking conclusion, didn't he, Em?
Yeah, he sort of asked, it was sort of like I wouldn't say a throwaway line, but it was literally just a few lines at the end of this line of questioning, and he just sort of asked him, like, if he remembered in March 2003, if he remembered that WA police asked him to be removed from the Claremont case. And so we were all like, what? And then he said he couldn't remember anything, and then he doesn't remember any conversation, and then it's sort of left at that. And then once Mr. Jovich had finished his cross-examination and Mr. Hollingsworth had finished his re-examination, Carmel Barbagallo then stood up and said to Justice Hall, well, hang on a minute, she wants to make a point about Mr. Jovich's questioning, and basically said, was there a point or is there any relevance to that question? And she described it as, was he engaging in general muck raking? So
what was his response to that?
Well, then she sort of said, because he sort of mentioned that he was relying on some either records of police meetings or emails that he also didn't want to disclose much more than that. He just said that there was meetings that made reference to Mr. Blooms, but Mr. Blooms wasn't included in this correspondence. But then he didn't explain any further, and then Miss Barbagallo was like, well, it can't just be some general jibe, sort of said in court. So then Justice Hall was like, well, sort of basically said to Mr. Jovich, if he's going to start, introducing evidence about a police officer's opinion of someone else, well, then it's only fair that he ask those or put those claims or assertions to the actual witness. And Mr. Jovich couldn't really say what that was. He said he didn't want to say at this stage. But then Justice Hall was like, well, the witness is here on the stand, so, it's only fair that, you're sort of making an assertion about his integrity here. And he said that, if he's, it could be that, he goes, basically, I think his words were that, there was a concern that his integrity had been impugned and that he's not had an opportunity to address whatever was raised because he doesn't know what he's actually implying took place. So basically Mr. Jovic just said that he didn't mean to cast aspersions, but that, he didn't want to disclose this at this stage. And in the end, Justice Hall, he didn't want to excuse, he let Mr. Blooms go and let him leave the court, but said he wasn't excusing him. So just on the, in case whenever these police witnesses are called, that if something is mentioned about him, that he can be called back to respond to those, to that evidence.
Tim, how did Martin Blooms take this? Because I guess in a way, his expertise is being questioned, but there's no actual specific accusation.
Yeah, it was a strange little back and forth just before lunchtime. That I've got to say, I mean, it wasn't gloves off, bare knuckle stuff between Ms. Barbagallo and Mr. Jovic, but it was certainly as pointed as they have been, I think, during the trial so far. And Ms. Barbagallo was quite forceful in saying, well, look, I mean, he said this, he hasn't produced any documents to back it up. He says he's not going to produce them to this witness, but might in the future. Where's the procedural fairness in that? And I've got to say, I think Justice Hall came down a little bit on her side and said, well, that's probably a fair comment. So, and Mr. Blooms was sort of sat in the middle, just listening to it all. Really didn't really say much at all, apart from when he was asked specifically about these emails. He said, well, I wasn't aware of them and I don't remember them. So whether he was or whether he wasn't, he's still a little, allowed to work or wanted to work on the Claremont case from that time. We don't really know. What we do know is he was still employed at Path West for another 9 years after that. So it wasn't obviously a major issue. But yeah, it was a strange little sidebar on a day where some new things were teased, but not really fully explored.
Definitely, that idea again, as we've seen with the living witnesses as well, the idea that something quite interesting is said, and in the courtroom, as journalists, your ears prick up, and then it takes you nowhere, and we're all left hanging, wondering what was the purpose of that, and will we come back to it?
Yeah, yes, we've had quite a lot of that in the last couple of weeks of sort of things starting but not being finished, and obviously we know the trial is nowhere near being finished yet.
We've heard in previous podcasts about the tests that were carried out in New Zealand, and today the scientist who did that testing took the stand as well.
Yes, she did. A lady called Sally Ann Harbison, who's a very senior scientist at the ESR lab in New Zealand. And this was, we briefly touched on it in my soliloquy on Friday about the DNA evidence. This was the extracts and the actual nail samples that went over to New Zealand. Ciara's nail samples, I should say, went over to New Zealand in 2004. They were packaged up and sent over there. And both the sort of tubes of liquid, all the extracts that had been previously done, and the nails themselves, so ESR could do their own extracts and testing on those. And so Ms. Harbison was walked through that, all those processes this afternoon. What they did, what the testing processes were, how they actually got the nails to New Zealand, and what they did with them when they got there. All that type of continuity stuff again. And as we touched on last week, they don't find anything in terms of another contributor to in Ciara's nails and in the other extracts. But what the prosecution will say when all's said and done is that those negative results, if you want, are actually a positive for us, because there's no sign of any contamination on any of those nails or any of those other extracts, which show that this contamination theory from the defence is fantasy.
One of the things that Dr. Harbison did say that I think had us in the media room sort of going, what? Was when she talked about a test that they carried out on AJM42, which is the left middle finger from fingernail from Ciara Glennon, that the prosecution says that when combined with AJM40, the left thumbnail produces this DNA profile, which they say belongs to Bradley Edwards. Basically, she was saying that, because one of the things that they did when they got the exhibits got to ESR was that they did like a Y chromosome test on the subsample extracts. I hope I have that right, Brendan. On the ones that had already been prepared at Pathwest. But then ESR did their own tests on the actual parent exhibits, which is the term that's been quite used in the trial so far, to the actual exhibits, because all the other testing has been taken on like tiny subsamples that were created from the original. So anyway, one of the things that they said is that when they were going through the process of creating their own sample from AJM42, was that they opened up the sealed tube. They did a wet swab and a dry swab of the actual nail and inside the tube. And then she said what they did was then they took out the actual fingernail and put it in a sealed plastic bag and then photocopied it. And then took it out of the bag and put it back into the plastic tube. And we were like, oh, did we hear that right? And we thought, is that normal? And then they sort of went a bit further into it, and basically I think Brad Hollingsworth sort of asked, were these bags clean? Were they sterile? And she said, well, they were clean, but she said she didn't want to say that they were sterile because they resembled little plastic sealed bags that you get in commercial supermarkets, but of course they were ones that only labs use, but she said that's basically what they look like. And then when asked why she did that, she said because back in 2004 they didn't have digital cameras, and so we were like, I'm sure digital cameras were around in 2004. We don't know, but that's what she said. They didn't have digital cameras, so that their practice at the time was to take out an exhibit, put it in a plastic bag, and then photocopy it and then put it back in. And even Justice Hall sort of asked questions about that because he thought that sounded a bit strange, but apparently that was the practice at the time. But then Mr. Hollingsworth did ask, did that affect the test results? And she said no. So that was sort of quite an interesting sort of little part that we were like, oh, didn't realise you did that. But it seemed quite strange to us because she's sort of photocopying, if you can sort of visualise that process of, oh, here we go, put it in a bag, press like the photocopy machine, and then they've got this picture of it, and then they put it back into the container or the tube.
Yeah, and I guess this is probably the first time that we've heard about someone actually taking a sample out of its sterile environment and moving it into another place and then popping it back. So did they ask whether tweezers were used and were gloves used in this process of taking it out of the tube, into a plastic bag, back into the tube?
No, but I'm sure they will get to that, and I'm definitely sure Mr. Jovich will ask those questions. But I think, this was just before proceedings finished today, so I think they sort of only just touched on that as it was beginning. But we just thought that was an interesting sort of little bit. And then there was another section in that sort of line of questioning which was related to, I think they were going through a document of all the lists of what was on the list when they received it from Pathwest, and the Brad Hollingsworth was reading out the list, and then they described something as being in a chili bin. So anyone that has Kiwi friends will know what that means. But anyway, sort of it was said, and then sort of a few seconds passed, and then Justice Hall sort of says, "Oh well, it's someone from New Zealand when you're talking about a chili bin." And then there was this sort of light little chuckle in court, especially from the bar table. And then Dr. Harbison was just like, "Oh yes," and then I think she was asked, "Can you explain what a chili bin is?" And then she said, "Oh, I believe it's an esky." So that was kind of a little bit of a light relief in today, which was quite heavy and taxing. Sort of if you're listening intently like we were, sort of constantly listening to this, very technical evidence, and then a bit of light relief about chili bins.
So it sounds like it really was one of those very interesting days. There was the ups and the downs and, the quite heavy stuff, but also these light moments that you sometimes don't expect in a trial like this.
Well, we've been talking about expertise, science that is probably way above the average man and woman on the street. No offence to any DNA forensic scientists listening, but then we have these critical exhibits being transferred over to New Zealand in an esky and then being placed in a sandwich bag and then being placed on a photocopier. So amidst all this science and all this expertise and technique and technical technique, these little moments that show that these scientists are human just like the rest of us.
And as you mentioned, Tim, there was no result from any of these tests that were done in New Zealand in terms of finding a male profile or anything like that?
So we were running through the results in evidence this afternoon. But what we do know from the opening address that Mr. Barbagallo gave many, many weeks ago now is that nothing that took pointed to a new suspect or anything like that was found in New Zealand. But what they are bringing this to the attention, A, to show the continuity, B, it also shows that how far macro investigators were willing to go to try and get this breakthrough. And C, most importantly, it will show, the prosecutors say, that there was no sign of any contamination on any of these other exhibits, including AJM42, which we know is then part of the crucial breakthrough in 2008 when it goes on another journey to the UK.
Do you know what will be in court tomorrow? Will Dr. Harbison be cross-examined?
She will. Quite lengthily, if Mr. Bloom's example is anything to go by today. She's obviously in person, come over from New Zealand, so there'll be quite a way to go in her evidence in chief, and then her cross-examination will take place. Mr. Jovich at one point said today that he's got no problem with the continuity of the nails actually getting to New Zealand. He's not going to prosecute that, so it'll just be from the point where the tubes are opened, I suppose, that we'll start off when she's cross-examined tomorrow.
Okay, well, we look forward to hearing from you both tomorrow. Thanks both for your time today. Tim and I will be back for tomorrow's podcast, along with forensic scientist Brendan Chapman, and we'll shoot all your questions through to him then. Chat tomorrow for day 40 of Claremont in Conversation.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.